Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar for the Sunshine State Digital Network, Digital Preservation, for an introduction to digital preservation. Our presenter today is Crystal Thomas. She's the head of digital archives at Florida State University. I am Kayla Sayas-Ruiz. I'm the program director for the Sunshine State Digital Network. Today's session is being recorded. We have also enabled captions. So if you would like to view the captions, just click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. These are automated, so there might be some errors. Otherwise, feel free to type questions in the chat if you have any that come up, and Crystal will answer those at the end. And I think that's all the housekeeping. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Crystal.
Thank you, Kayla. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon to talk about and think about digital preservation. As Kayla said, I'm Crystal Thomas. I'm the Director of Digital Archives at Florida State University Libraries. I've held this position for almost 14 years now, and a part of that work has always been the digital preservation work that we do here at the libraries. For today's presentation, we're going to keep it pretty big picture. I'm not going to go too much into specific workflows or tools, but hopefully we can set you up to start you forward working with your digital objects and also provide you with some resources that will help you when you're ready to get into the sort of more detailed work of digital preservation. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so before we dive into today's presentation, I wanted to clarify the difference between a digital library and a digital archive. We all, myself included, if I am not paying close attention to how I'm saying things, tend to use these terms interchangeably, but they are in fact quite different. So a digital library is designed primarily for regular use by our end users. And don't forget, we are also our own end users. So this system of a digital library is meant to be open to the public. It's meant to be very user-friendly, and it's meant to be the system where decisions are made all around the goal of making our materials as accessible as possible at all times. And that includes decisions around description and imaging and access and so forth. A digital archive, or sometimes more accurately called a dark archive, is built for the singular goal of long-term preservation of digital objects. So a system like this should be less open. The fewer people with access, the better. That means less error can be introduced into the system. It may not always be the most user-friendly place, and that's actually on purpose. And it is a system designed to be, in general, simply less accessible and more difficult to interact with the objects, because the less you can interact with them, the less you can potentially introduce a problem with your files. So with those differences in mind, we're going to move on to our first big question of the day. What is not digital preservation? Now, it seems odd to potentially be starting with defining what digital preservation is not, but hopefully this will help make clear what it is when we get to that question. So just stay with me here, okay? What is not digital preservation? Backups are meant to restore in the case of a system failure. Digital preservation is the long-term preservation of digital objects beyond a system failure. So backups can and should indeed be part of a preservation plan, but it cannot be the start and end of it. Also, you need to be sure that you're checking in with your backups regularly. I probably ask our IT folks once a year to explain to me just one more time how our backups are created, kept, and tested for accuracy and where they fit in our disaster planning for recovery if a system failure is to occur. And I'm sure they're really tired of me asking. But knowing and understanding the systems already in place at your organization is part of the overall idea of digital preservation, even though it is not the entirety of it. Digitization is also not preservation. You'll still need to preserve the digitized copy that you've created after all. Digitization can be used as part of a physical preservation plan to ease handling on overused materials or to provide better access to items for your patrons, but it is not on its own preservation. And then lastly, digital preservation is not simply having your materials on a hard drive in a closet that you never touch, or even worse, having them stored on some other media that is fast having issues with finding hardware to play it. I don't know about you all, but none of the computers I can see in front of me have a CD player in them anymore. So you want to be sure that digital preservation is not reliant on media that is fast becoming obsolete. There's the word I'm looking for. So if that is what digital preservation is not, what exactly is it? Digital preservation is an active, ongoing process to manage all of your digital objects and to ensure their continued accessibility over time. So digital preservation is not something you can just turn on and never look at it again, but it is something you need to be monitoring and managing and engaging with consistently. What is a digital object in this sort of framework of digital preservation? A digital object is both the content file and its metadata. So, for example, that can be the PDF file that has the actual content that you are preserving, and then descriptive metadata about the contents of that PDF, the technical metadata of how to open and engage with that PDF, and then some administrative metadata, potentially saying that that PDF was created when you migrated that document from a Word document into a PDF for better preservation. So a digital object engages all of that different kind of information, and that's what you are preserving moving forward. Digital preservation work is based on international recognized standards and models such as the Open Archival Information System model, or OAIS. That model is where we get the SIPs, APES, and DIPs terminology that you may have heard along the way if you've looked into digital preservation at all. These models are what provide a common set of concepts and definitions that help us across organizations have discussions and facilitate specifications for archives and digital preservation systems. Now, side note, often in literature or in the digital preservation sort of bigger system, you will hear about OAIS discussed in terms of the software systems that are built to meet it. Those systems can be quite intimidating and overwhelming. You can use OAIS a lot more simply and focus in instead on the policies and procedures that that standard recommends creating rather than the complex software which can help you create it, but is not required or is not something you actually have to have in order to create it. There's a link in my notes that you all receive after to an article by Seth Shaw. It was published last year, which is a really useful article to think through that sort of difference and the different methods for approaching meeting the OAIS standard at your organization that is completely outside of any software you might use. So what is the ideal for digital preservation? There are a couple of big key ideas. One is that you should have multiple copies of your digital objects. Two locations in different disaster threat zones is usually the minimum. The ideal is somewhere between 6 to 8 copies that are geographically distributed. You want to have common or normalized file formats. You want to have metadata for every single digital object that you are stewarding. And you want to have controlled and known storage of your content. And this can be offline, nearline, or online. So offline is your very traditional CDs, tapes, external hard drives. It's not necessarily ideal at a big institutional level anymore because those can become quite expensive to maintain quickly. Nearline is stored on offline media, but you send data in and out via an online connection. Amazon Glacier works that way. And then online is network and cloud storage, which is where many organizations have turned to for digital preservation storage in recent years. Another thing I do want to emphasize about what digital preservation is it's active management. And that means you are monitoring integrity of your objects, making sure nothing has become changed or corrupt, particularly at bit level. You are actively determining security and access needs to your digital preservation objects. That is very different than the access to public copies, as I discussed about what digital preservation or the difference between a digital library and a digital archive. You want less access and more security with your digital preservation files. You are actively monitoring your authenticity or the provenance of your files. You are documenting where the digital object came from, what has been done to it over time, why that was done, etc. And then you are, if needed, migrating to a different file format or even a different storage location if and when. An example of this is, say you have a past perfect document, really old school, right? That's software that is not reliably available anymore. So you would need to migrate that file to a more stable long-term preservation format, such as PDF. So that is what digital preservation is. Now we're going to dig into a couple of nitty-gritty details. And the first one is around files. And I'm going to try real hard not to get on my soapbox here. But file formats are one of those active management aspects of digital preservation. You have to be really thinking and engaged and hands-on when it comes to file formats that you're bringing into your digital preservation. So there's the difference between open source and proprietary, and this is not always as clear as we like to think about it. For example, technically, the TIFF file format, which is a really common still image file format that we use and is considered a preferred file format for preservation, is technically proprietary. But due to other factors down the list, it is still considered a perfectly fine file format to use for preservation. A really great resource for guidance on file formats is the Library of Congress recommended format statement. It is updated annually with more information around the difference between open source, proprietary, and recommended file formats. Another thing to keep in mind here is the availability of documentation on a file format and how you work with it. And that's why TIFF wins above, because while it is still technically owned by a company, we have access to all of the documentation about the TIFF file format, meaning we can provide access to them even if that company disappears. We have the same situation with the PDF file format and Adobe. This allows for the maintenance of those file formats long after the originating company has disappeared. Also, in the case of these two examples, PDFs and TIFFs, the file formats are so widely adopted as to allow for reverse engineering if we ever really needed to. Another great resource for this is Pronom. They are the UK National Archives equivalent to the LOC's recommended file formats. But Pronom is actually regularly updated, and honestly, I find it a bit easier to search. If you particularly have a file extension that you need to identify, Pronom is a really good fit for that. Another thing to think about with file formats is the adoption of it. How widely is that format used? More adoption is good. It means more people will need to work with you on the problem of perpetual access. There's a good example here, another still image file format type JPEG 2000, which many of you may have heard of. Photographers hated it. And so they didn't adopt it. And it was considered a preservation standard and still is by many GLAM institutions. It just has never reached the adoption level of TIFF files. And that's why TIFF files sort of are more widely used for preservation than JPEG 2000. Another thing to keep in mind with your file formats is lossless versus lossy. So lossless is for your masters. This is a mechanism for reducing file sizes that retains all original data. So you don't need to keep the raw files. A lossless file will still have everything for you. And lossy should be used for your access files because that is one that reduces file size but can discard data to do so. The thing to keep in mind here is the human eye is really amazing, but it can rarely tell the difference meaningfully between a TIFF file and a JPEG file. So Lossy allows you to provide excellent access with smaller file sizes that are going to load easier and faster and take up a lot less space in your public access system. Another thing to think about with your file formats is, does it allow you to embed metadata in it? This one isn't necessarily a deal breaker for me. I do actually prefer descriptive and administrative metadata to be external to a content file. But at minimum, technical metadata should definitely be embedded in an object to help perpetual access to it over time. And then the last thing to think about with file formats is, what are the properties? You potentially don't need to commit to saving an exact copy. but you need to preserve one that will have meaning and value to a future user. A good example of this is saving emails as PDFs for your archive rather than attempting to save it as a .eml or .mbox, because those can be trickier and have different affordances to access on the other side. This is also one of the areas where over time disk images or disk imaging, which you may have also heard of, has fallen a bit out of favor in GLAM digital preservation circles. We found over time that few users could actually meaningfully use them at the end of the day, and many required specific software to access them, and that created a new barrier to preservation in its own way. So being sure that you are creating digital preservation files that you can actually access is just as important as well. And then another thing to think about file formats is file naming. And I have potentially unnecessarily strong feelings about file naming in general. Couple of things to keep in mind around your file naming is being consistent. Don't change it up constantly. Find a system that works, document it, and stick with it. Follow good computing rules. You should not have spaces or weird characters, as those can cause access issues, either currently when you're trying to work to get together the set of digital objects you're going to preserve, or in the future. An example of this we ran into, we were copying files off floppy disks. We had hundreds of floppy disks that came in with a collection. And that particular creator loved to use periods all over his file names, which was fine back in the day. The system didn't care. Modern Windows machines and Mac machines don't like anything more than the period and the executable command after, right? So when there were multiple periods in the file, the computer had no idea what to do with the file. How do I open this? What kind of file is this? So being real clear about what characters are okay in a file name and which ones aren't is important in a file naming convention. In a perfect world, you would have a set of file naming rules that is documented for your organization, that is used for your digital preservation work, that is used for any digitization projects that are going on in your organization, and that people are educated and using it consistently. And then last thing about file naming is when possible and applicable, your file name should be an important part of the metadata for your file. You should be able to find, say, the physical item from the file name. You can see an example on the screen. Or if it is a digitized item, or if you are working with born digital objects, you should make sure that the collection information, like the collection number or ID, is part of its file name. One of the reasons that this is a super important rule to keep in mind is it will help avoid having an image -001 for every directory you ever open. How on earth will you ever tell them apart in the future? And also, you should not rely on directory structure to always be there. It's really easy for files to wander out of directories. It's really easy for directory names to potentially become corrupt over time. You want to make sure that single content file has at least this basic amount of information just attached to it at all times. Um, that will help over the course of you stewarding that digital object through its lifespan with you. Okay, how am I doing on time? All right. So, why should you be thinking, concerned, potentially losing sleep over digital preservation? You should not be losing sleep. Don't be doing that. The reason you should care is there's so many risks when it comes to digital objects in general. There's just so much that can go wrong. As I often tell my students when I'm teaching a digital libraries class, we better understand how to preserve objects from the 13th century than I can promise we can preserve the Word document you created this morning. That is simply the truth of the matter. And lots of things go into that truth. One is the proliferation and pace. Everyone is creating digital records at all times, all days, weeks, months, years. So we have just an explosion of the number of files we're dealing with. We also have rapid technology change, which means obsolescence is a guarantee, not just something that may happen. Floppy disks, tapes, CDs, who even has drives to look at some of that stuff anymore, right? Another thing that is a risk is technical failure with your storage media, with your ingest process, with your transfer process. Digital objects are incredibly fragile things, and one little bit missing can destroy an entire file. So that can also be a risk you're taking on. Digital objects are complex, not just because they are both a file and metadata, but to access that file, there may be layers. Do you need a specific operating system? Do you need a specific piece of software? Do either of those things even still exist? You start to really build up all the places things could potentially go wrong. Humans are also a risk. We always mean well, but we're often part of the problem. Legally, you may need to be able to access these digital objects forever. Are you potentially risking non-compliance by not being proactive and working with them now? Also, on the institutional level, legality is important, as I just said, but it also took a lot of resources to acquire or create those digital objects to begin with. So there is a risk to the institution to lose them and that they wasted a lot of time and money potentially on them if they are lost. Natural disasters. I'm speaking about this from Florida, which is in an area of the country that really needs to make sure it's including digital preservation in our disaster planning at all times. Metadata is also a potential risk. Different people create it, store it all around. They create different amounts. They use different standards to create it. No one really agrees half the time on how to use the same standard. So metadata introduces other risk. And then there is institutional support and stability. And that's financial support, having policies in place when people leave, succession planning, and understanding and acknowledging acknowledgement of what is needed to do digital preservation work and get that support to do it right out of the gate. So that was a lot. And now I have a very hard and somewhat scary truth. And I tell you all that and I share this with you not to scare you. In fact, I bet most of you already knew this. But you have to understand where you're starting from. Because unlike with our physical collections, we are at a disadvantage with digital files from the moment they are created. And in many ways, you are in a preservation race with digital files that has absolutely no equivalent in the physical archive side. Audiovisual materials are maybe the closest physical equivalent in the archives to born digital files in particular. So you're dealing with that from the moment these files are created. And we're going to take that all in. We're going to take in all of those risks I just went under, and we're going to use a great 20th century piece of wisdom, and we're not going to panic. Because now you know what digital preservation is. You understand why it is important to your organization and to its digital objects. What can you do right now? And I love this quote from Elizabeth Labod. Was at the University of Southern Mississippi. And this sentiment has been said many times. I think the past two Society of American Archivists presidents have also said something similar in their addresses to SAA. Doing something is better than doing nothing at all. And that is particularly true when it comes to digital objects. So what can you do right now? You can start by being proactive, which you are doing. You are here. The amount of digital objects in your organization is only going to increase over time. But also, another truth is that the older digital objects become, the more attention that they are going to need in the digital preservation system. So being proactive means asking all the questions and documenting the answers. If there isn't documentation about digital preservation at your organization already, this is the moment to start it. If you think that your digital objects are currently being backed up, here's where you ask how, where, when, and what exactly is being backed up. And also ask to test restoring from a backup periodically in order to make sure that process is actually working. Remember that backups are only a part of a bigger digital preservation plan, but it is a really easy place to start with your plan because even a no is good information because then you at least know that's where you're starting from and maybe is the first piece of your digital preservation puzzle. The other part of being proactive is looking around and seeing if you do have digital objects stored with vendors and making sure that there are actual exit strategies because no vendor is forever. So really, you're information gathering by being proactive. And then you want to look around and start to educate the people you might be working with. Educate those creating digital files in your organization on those common file formats and the file naming conventions I just went over. Make sure you're creating documentation and sharing it often and widely with your organization. If you are overseeing digitization projects or you know that those are happening in your institution, make sure that file formats and file naming conventions have also been taken into account with those projects as well. This is the time when you can talk to your IT people or maybe your IT person. Your needs for digital preservation are really quite unique. And IT folks can be allies, but they need some education first before they can really help you in this sort of work. And then you also need to educate your acquisitions and processing colleagues as well. Digital preservation needs to be something that they are actively thinking about when they're working with donors and potentially bringing in new collections that may have born digital materials that you're going to have to deal with. Something really easy and a great place to start is simply create an inventory. And this doesn't have to be fancy. It can just be a spreadsheet. We all love a spreadsheet. And collect the information. What collection is it? Where is that collection stored? What file formats does that collection hold? And how big is it in the terms of like gigabytes, terabytes, etc.? That's all you need to get started. But that does require you to hunt up collections that might only be on local computers, that might be on random servers that no one's looked at in years. It might be with third-party vendors. It might be sitting on your website, and that's the only place it lives anymore. It's a bit of a scavenger hunt, but you are constantly adding more to your information gathering and knowledge of what it is you're being asked to steward. Also, when you create this inventory, make sure that it is not siloed. Make sure that you are storing it in a place that everyone in your organization can see it, can potentially help you add to it, add information to it. And while you're creating this inventory, it's really easy to also potentially mark areas of concern. Are there collections that have potential copyright, privacy, or legal issues? Are there collections that very clearly have obsolete file types that you're going to have to deal with sooner rather than later? This inventory can help you in the future prioritize the order in which you're going to work on collections or work on certain digital objects. Next, you're going to create a policy. And I'm going to say something that everyone always doesn't like me to say, but I'm going to say it. Just because something is digital does not mean it has to be saved forever. Archival appraisal and selection still applies. You do not need, you cannot afford, I do not need, and I cannot afford to save it all. The Digital Preservation Coalition, or DPC, says it much nicer than I do. They're British, it's probably why. They say simply because everything could be in scope for a digital preservation strategy does not mean that everything should be in scope. So keep that in mind as you're starting to think through what your policy at your organization is going to be. And often the people will come back to me and be like, well, storage is cheap. Storage is not actually cheap when you start to talk about terabytes worth of material. But setting aside the idea of storage is cheap, the work of digital preservation is not cheap. It takes human resources, it takes time, it takes training, and it takes expertise to do this work well. So what I recommend is making sure you are matching your digital preservation policy to your mission at your institution and that you use policies you may already have around collection development, around certain institutional priorities, around what your core record and content types are that you typically collect. You do not need to be reinventing the wheel necessarily when it comes to creating a digital preservation policy. One, because you may already have policies in place that are relevant and you can kind of call whatever you need from those. But also, so many institutions have written and shared their digital preservation policies online. My recommendation is to look for a comparable institution to yourself for guidance. And if you don't see one, ask them. A lot of places do have these policies, they just might not have them up online necessarily. If you're kind of striking out there, simply Google digital preservation policy and you're going to get a million and one examples. I also would direct you to organizations like DPC, like I said, and also to the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, the NDSA. Those organizations were created to help places navigate digital preservation, and that includes best practices for developing policies to fit your needs. This is my last sort of thing you can do today. Don't try to do all the things at once. It's just going to stress you out and you're going to get overwhelmed and you're not going to get anywhere. I know because I did that the first time I attempted to do that here at FSU when I was hired. So don't try to do all the things all at once. Um, Work on your inventory, get a good idea of what you actually have around, and then start small. Focus in on one collection or maybe even just one type of preservation activity. You can experiment, you can learn, you can ask questions as you are moving forward through that inventory and collecting information and sort of deciding how to prioritize. A really great tool for that is the NDSA levels of preservation. That can help you evaluate where you are once you sort of have that inventory, have a good idea of what you're dealing with, and then sort of decide where you want to focus first and sort of what your goals might be as you start and work on a digital preservation project at your institution. Throughout this all, just keep collecting and documenting information and the data. Everything you learn is important, even if it doesn't work quite the way you thought it was going to. Even that information may someday help you prove that it's actually cheaper to pay for a vendored service around digital preservation for all of that work rather than try to handle it yourself or all in-house. Um, However, this is the moment where I ask you not to start with a service or tool and then work from there. All of the different options that you can pay vendors for, all the different tools, they're all really great and wonderful. But if you don't have an idea of what you're trying to do, if you don't have a policy and sort of a good idea of digital preservation culture in place at your institution and what you're trying to do with preservation, that tool or service may actually cause more problems than solve them. Or potentially worse, that may be underutilized, which might make it hard to justify its continuing costs when you're actually up and ready to start using that tool more effectively and more regularly. So just keep all those things in mind as you start to move forward and think through how do I handle the digital objects at my institution? Now, we are obviously just scratching the surface here of this topic today, so I wanted to leave you with lots of resources that can help as you start to collect data about digital preservation and digital objects at your organizations. So I've mentioned the Digital Preservation Coalition already, but they have a handbook. It's a really fabulous introduction to digital preservation. It is approachable and it's really useful as a place to start to get all the big concepts down. DPC in general is just, like I said, a fabulous organization. You should follow them. They have a great blog that is quite active. They're also an international organization. And so they provide lots of practical information about the actual work of digital preservation and how people are doing it all over the world. They're really great about sharing some interesting projects that get done internationally around digital preservation, because it is always great to learn how other people are doing it as well. For file format help, we have the Library of Congress recommended format statement and Pronum. I mentioned them both earlier. Those are both file format registries that can be helpful with questions about how to handle file formats you might encounter or what are considered standard preservation file formats you might need to migrate files to. Copter is a tool repository. So if you've done your inventory, you have a policy, and you're like, okay, we now need a tool to do fixity for files. Copter's a good place to go and see what are tool options and also see any reviews from others in the digital preservation community who've used it and may or may not recommend it. I noticed when I was looking at Copter in preparation for today, they are now also collecting workflows, which I think could be super handy to browse and sort of see how other institutions are using tools in their digital preservation workflows and procedures. Um, never reinvent the wheel if you can possibly help it. I mentioned the NDSA levels of preservation. They just updated those the end of last year, might have been the beginning of this year. The NDSA is now actually housed with NISO. And as I mentioned, the levels of preservation are a great place to just start as an evaluation tool to sort of see where you are in the big picture and decide where you might want to get to. And that will help you also sort of grow your goals for a digital preservation program at your organization. I like to point people to the Signal, which is the Library of Congress's digital stewardship blog. They don't share exclusively digital preservation stories and information, but that is one of their topic areas. It's also just really cool to know what LOC is up to when it comes to their digital projects. I include Track here. Now, Track is very high level, but its checklist can help you, much like the NDSA levels of preservation, get a big picture about potentially what you want to be aiming for in a digital preservation program. Track is also now technically an ISO standard, which was news to me. But I'm actually linking you here to the original checklist document that was created by OCLC, NARA, and CRL in 2007. Still completely accurate and on point, but it's a much friendlier and more useful document than the ISO website. At least that was what I found. And then last but not least, Premise is the international standard for metadata that is used to support the preservation of digital objects and ensure their long-term usability. Premise is basically a way that you can track the events that you may do to a digital object as part of its preservation workflow. The premise is where you would say you migrated a Word document into a PDF file for a format, for example. It can be useful to just kind of take a gander at premise, even if you are like not using it or not planning to use it at any time in the future. Because you can probably easily supplement your current metadata practices with premise events potentially, or at least get an idea of what you should be tracking in your current metadata setup. And I apparently spoke real fast today, but that is okay. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. And if anyone has any questions, can feel free to drop them into the chat.
Crystal, and thank you everyone for giving Crystal a round of applause. As she mentioned, if you have any questions, you can feel free to enter them in the chat. If you would prefer to ask a question, not in the chat, you can raise your hand and I can give you permission to unmute. Um, there's a lot of moving parts to digital preservation, so uh,
There very much is. And it, like I said, it causes everyone a lot of stress because they're all worried about not doing it right. But there's no guarantee even if you do it right, to be honest. Um, we recently pulled something from our digital preservation system and we found the file that we thought was in there wasn't in there. So, it doesn't always go perfectly even when you think you know what you're doing.